Ladies and gentlemen, Jacob Zuma was correct when he wanted to implement nuclear deals for South Africa. We wanted to be schooled on this, so we invited a nuclear specialist. And joining us is Princess. Hello, Princess.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Roman. Hi, Byron.
So, just to introduce yourself, can you tell us who you are and why you're an expert on nuclear?
My name is Princess Mthombeni. Many people call me Princey. I am a nuclear communication specialist. That makes me an expert. I've been in the nuclear industry for over a decade and got to understand it and travel to the world actually advocating for nuclear in Africa.
And that is something very close to the heart of the Morning Shot team, Byron and I. And we spoke a little bit just before we started recording, and you were on the record as saying Koeberg is probably the best power station South Africa has ever had and probably will ever have in time to come. Why Koeberg in particular?
Number one, Koeberg offers the most cheapest electricity, and that basically because it's a paid-off asset. And Koeberg has a possibility to operate for for another 20 years, and that will depend on whether it meets the safety requirements. After the Portfolio Committee on Energy has approved for Koeberg to operate for the next 20 years. Koeberg has been there for almost 40 years now. It started operating in 1984. And Koeberg offers the most reliable and clean energy, clean electricity to 50% of Western Cape community.
So, we did a video around a year ago when we said if South Africa wanted to solve the energy crisis, the easiest way for it to do it would be to get small nuclear reactors from the Russians. The Russians are very famous. They do build these things like they're going out of fashion. And these little small reactors are powerful enough to power small generation or small cities. Now, obviously, the West doesn't like this idea because, Russian bad and all the other stuff that goes with it. But in South Africa, we know that we are pursuing what's commonly referred to as the green energy deal, which means solar panels and wind farms. And we've done many videos on that, on why that will not be sufficient for the energy needs of South Africa. So the safe assumption is that if South Africa wanted to become energy independent, it would invest all in on nuclear. What would that look like in your opinion?
Number one, Byron, I would say that it's actually a known fact that Russians are one of the leading experts in nuclear technology. But then again, and in terms of small modular reactors, what Russians have done is they have what they call floating nuclear reactor. It's a power ship, so it's floating in the sea at Pervik. So it's what they have done. But we also have other technology developers from US, which is NewScale. We also have Rolls-Royce in the UK. Also in Canada, we have Starcore. So there are many energy technology developers in terms of small modular reactors, which South Africa can partner with if they want them. It doesn't necessarily have to be Russians. But when it comes to the conventional nuclear power plant, which are those that we call like Koeberg, which is the PWRs, what is it? PWRs. I'll explain that later. But those conventional nuclear reactors that needs to be built near the sea. Perhaps we can say that Russians can be a very good partner in that, and because they have built such reactors in many countries. They are currently building in Egypt as well. They are also building in Turkey, and at some point even the United Kingdom wanted to partner with them. So we have Russians technology, conventional nuclear reactors being built by many countries as we speak right now. With regards to South Africa, really going 100% nuclear, it's not possible. I don't know of any country except France, which is, by the way, mostly powered by nuclear. But that would take time and decades. But what South Africa can do right now is to increase the capacity of nuclear and build another Koeberg nuclear power plant, because currently the total electricity of South Africa comes the 5% of total electricity of total electricity in South Africa comes from nuclear, which is Koeberg. So we need to increase that 5%. That will take at least maybe building the 9,600 megawatts that President Zuma proposed during his time. At the moment, what we have is the Integrated Resource Plan 2019 to 2030, which actually reflects only 2,500 megawatts of nuclear capacity, which is something very small, taking into consideration that South Africa is planning to decommission about 21,000 megawatts of their coal power plants. And honestly, coal offers us base load. And if you decommission coal power plants, then you need to have another base load to replace those coal power plants. And for me, the base load that we need is nuclear.
No, thank you, Princess, because I think that's what people don't really understand, what base load actually means. You've got all these other countries on solar and on wind generation and all that. Yeah, fine, but they've built a base load over decades on nuclear or coal or whatever the case might be, and these are added on to that base load, but they don't form the foundation of the base load. So for the audience, what is the base load when you talk about it in that perspective?
Thanks, Romain. What the Pennsylvania University explains when it comes to baseload, they are saying it's power plants that continuously meet the minimum demand of power 24/7. Simple as that. So they need to operate continuously to meet the minimum demand, and they do not need to be dependent on weather.
Okay, so everything except renewables in that case can be based.
No, it's what is the minimum?
Except wind and solar, because hydro is able to operate 24/7.
That's me being fact-checked.
What is the absolute minimum that we have to run in terms of, if we just run everything at a hum, what's the minimum electricity we need? There's no ramp up, there's no extremities, what's the minimum? And then everything extra is an additional. Is that correct?
I think what we have right now at Eskom is minimum, and we can run South Africa with that power because we have over 40,000 megawatt installed capacity at Eskom. But because of load shedding, they are only able to give us about 20,000 megawatt when we have load shedding. So if we can have all that operating, which is basically rather almost impossible, because some power plants, they are in such condition that they can no longer operate and they need to be shut down. And we also have 6,500, by the way, which is very important. We have 6,500 megawatt capacity of renewables, particularly wind and solar, and concentrated solar contracted by Eskom. And when we have load shedding and during peak time, when Eskom reports, that 6,500 megawatt only give us about 1,400, which I'm being generous, by the way. So that's basically what explains base load, because when it's during peak hours, that's when the sun is not shining.
So okay, I think this is what you call the...
I just want to clarify this, Ramon, just so that we understand it, because this is such an important point of where we are and obviously what capacity does. So baseload, as I'm understanding it from what you're describing, it is what do we need as a country just to run everything, and then everything that we add on to it allows us that extra capacity for grid expansion and so forth. But then what's the benefit of switching from purely baseload to adding additional?
Adding additional of renewables.
Yeah, what would be the benefit?
If we switch off the base load, there are no benefits except that maybe you can say that in terms of climate change effect, because if you switch off coal, that means you are adding clean technology, which is renewables, and you are reducing carbon emissions.
So
That's
let's
just
use
one
the
thing.
so let's use the example of Eskom. So if Eskom runs at base and everything runs just fine, if they plug in the private sector with renewables, does that mean that what Eskom can do is like run a plant at less than 100%, say at 50%, and like if it needs to restore itself back up to baseload, it can? So is that what a benefit, that Eskom doesn't have to run at like full capacity because it can purchase in some of the electricity? Is that correct?
No, I would say that because once that private electricity comes and Eskom gets it from their grid, usually it gets Eskom gets that electricity when Eskom does not need it, because that's when now all of us are busy at work, and it's like feeding yourself when you're already full. So that's basically what happens. So Eskom gets to feed itself with these renewables, private renewables, when it's full. Then by the time now Eskom needs these renewables, when we are all back at work and we are now using electricity, it doesn't work.
So, Princess, I mean, I agree with you on that. And it's actually quite a good analogy that renewables are like, caviar when you are full. That's actually a very good analogy to use. But if we go back in time in South Africa to the nuclear deal, if I remember correctly, the nuclear deal was roughly 1.3 or 1.4 trillion rand at the time. And then these sort of things are never really costed accurately. Maybe they double in price. And this was all ended because a foreign funded NGO went to court and ended it, very democratic of them. So the counter narrative of nuclear is it's very, very expensive. And Princess, we're in South Africa. The politicians like to, it's their time to eat. How can we be sure that all that money that goes towards nuclear will not be siphoned off somewhere else and leaving us without nuclear in the first place?
Number one, let's correct the misinformation that nuclear was going to cost about 1.3 trillion rand. It was misinformation. That's why, Roman, when you go to that thick report from Zondo Commission, there's no word nuclear, because no one could prove those allegations that nuclear was going to cost 1.3 trillion. The experts during that time, they actually said nuclear was going to cost just above 500 billion, which is 600, I think 600 billion rand. They did say that, but no one gave them attention. And now another thing is that in order for us to know how much nuclear build is going to cost in South Africa, we need to go through a request for information, request for proposal process, and which really during that time we did not do. We did not do that process. And what we only did the request for information, which is just for informational purposes, really. And then once then the request for proposal process is done, it tells us how much nuclear is going to cost. So we did not do that process. So as it is, we are not sure how much nuclear build was going to cost in South Africa. Another thing is that people interpreted that South Africa wanted to build all nuclear reactors, about how many of them, because it was 9,600 megawatt, which has never happened anywhere in the world. You do not build nuclear like that. You start by one reactor, followed by another one, followed by another one. So right now in Egypt, they are building a nuclear power plant. They are starting with the first reactor, but they are eventually going to build 4 reactors. And the project is going to cost about 25 to 28 billion US dollars, which is still not a trillion.
And in terms of funding those nuclear reactors, how does it actually work? Because in South Africa, as we know, state capture is a real thing. Was there any chance that the funds for nuclear could have been, siphoned off for political reasons rather than build nuclear? Or is there an international system of costing nuclear and making sure that what you pay is what you get?
Perhaps maybe that's the reason we do not have nuclear power plant in South Africa, because it's not easy to still when when you are building a nuclear power plant, because there's international financing models. One of them being the build, own, operate, and transfer. So nuclear industry is a highly regulated industry. So it's not really easy to do all these dodgy stuff. So maybe perhaps sometimes when I sit and ask myself, like, maybe that's the reason we don't have nuclear power plants, is because it's not easy for people to spill. But also again, what's on the public and what we all know is that we do not have a nuclear power plant because of geopolitics, because of people and agents planted in our countries to make sure that they oppose nuclear.
So you mentioned agents in the country that are opposing it. What is in it for them to oppose it?
An anti-nuclear campaign is big, Byron, and they are not only planted in South Africa; they are everywhere. They get funded, but now when it comes to probably South Africa, I mean, if you get funding to oppose something, we are a country that is underdeveloped, and there's an issue of high unemployment rate. So it does happen that when you get such deals, you make sure that you implement, whatever that you are required to implement. But yeah, over and above that, it's it's all connected to geopolitics. To say perhaps maybe no one wants us to develop or to industrialize.
So here's my conspiracy theory. And Byron, I'm speaking for myself, not Byron here. My conspiracy theory is that quite a lot of countries around the world want Africa to remain poor, including South Africa. Poor in terms of energy poverty, poor in terms of actual GDP numbers, because then you just bribe the politicians and you extract the wealth from those places without much of a fuss. It's much cheaper to pay off politicians and extract minerals than to sort of develop a mine properly, employ people to do the jobs well, and all that sort of stuff. So in a way, I do have the sense, without any evidence whatsoever, it's my conspiracy, that if South Africa developed its own nuclear capacity, if we did have GDP growth of 5%, if we did have energy to have that GDP growth of 5 to 10%, it would become far less interesting for certain interests around the world to be interested in South Africa, because we will be our own actual country with our own decisions and our own policies. Is that fair? Is that what you are seeing in the world as well?
That's what I'm seeing. Actually, there's a comment on one of the posts on LinkedIn, which was talking about, somebody posted on LinkedIn saying it was a post of an African woman with the child at the back, and then he said, we don't want you to be like us. Then a non-African person commented on that post saying Africans have always been innovative and talented in finding ways to solve the energy poverty. I was a little bit upset, and I commented saying, how do you find innovative and talent in people using cow dung, using coal, using candles, paraffin to address their energy needs? That's the question I asked, to say, don't say that's talent or innovation, because you are patronizing us. So your theory or your conspiracy theory, Roman, you may be onto something with it.
That's the problem with conspiracy theories, because the last 3 years, they've all come true, I'm afraid.
So being from a scientific,
really true.
A scientific background, we are not supposed to be speaking conspiracy theories.
Yeah, it's funny. I said this the other day to the Crown Prince Abdul. But I miss the days when conspiracy theories were just conspiracy theories. Now it's just like conspiracy theory is just a spoiler.
Yeah, you are scared to say it, and because it might come true.
Very much so. So what I'm really trying to understand is, in terms of South Africa, the only politician who coincidentally doesn't appear captured, which is still hilarious to say, is actually Gwede Matashe, because he doesn't want all this green rubbish. He's like, let's go and all in on coal and have some nuclear power stations. Is the minister as pro energy independence as we get a feel that he is?
I believe he is. I do believe he is, because I mean he's been consistent in his position on energy mix. And yeah, I do believe he is. But I also worry when he signs those different bid windows, renewables bid windows, because I don't know what he's trying to. But I mean, I know he gets pressured to sign them. But I don't know. I wouldn't sign them if I were him. But yeah, he is under pressure. He's under a lot of pressure. But I do believe that he's consistent. I'm not going to say he's not captured, because I don't know. But I do believe he's been consistent in his position on energy mix, and he deserves to be supported, because he may be speaking for whatever reasons that are behind him advocating for energy mix, but it benefits us as well as South Africans, and we need to support him.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. He's our favorite politician in this country. Okay, well, one of our favorite politicians in this country. Is there any argument against nuclear that has made you rethink your position? So a lot of anti-nuclear activists will say, well, look at Chernobyl, look at Fukushima, and the horrors those two things caused to the world. And when I actually look at the data, I'm trying to find the horror, and I'm trying to find a single person dying of radiation, other than the original first responders to Chernobyl. And even then, it's a little bit murky as to what they died of. A lot of them died just from the heat of the bloody power station, because that's what happens when you go towards a heat source like that. So in terms of safety of nuclear, like, is there something we should be concerned about? Is there a risk, or are these things really ironed out at this stage?
I'm glad you asked that. Number one, we should be proud of ourselves as South Africans. We have been safely operating Kuberg for almost 40 years. And at least let's give ourselves credit for that. And then with regards to incidents such as Chernobyl and Fukushima, basically Fukushima was a natural disaster. So and that's when we actually should be appreciating nuclear, because those reactors, they did a lot of good work. They were able to shut down and automatically. And no one really in Fukushima was or died due to radiation exposure. People were removed on time. And with regards then to the safety measures that are being incorporated when building nuclear reactors currently, because Chernobyl and Fukushima are generation 2 reactors. We have different generations. They fall under generation 2 reactors, and we are currently working on generation 4 reactors. So, and the latest generation of reactors or advanced nuclear reactors, they are built in such that they incorporate extra safety measures to avoid the disasters, or the kind of disasters such as Chernobyl and Fukushima.
So what's the hang up then in South Africa? I mean, I know a lot of people naturally, I know our audience will be like us, like they'll be thinking, ANC can't be trusted with any of this stuff. If we give them nuclear, they'll, build the power station using paper mesh, and we'll have a Chernobyl type disaster here in the middle of the Western Cape. I think that's the majority of how people think in the country, right? But from what you're saying is we're on like much later generation. We know that nuclear these days is far cleaner than it has been in the past. So what's the hang up? Well, why is there now a desire to go green? I know some people will say, yeah, but they get captured too much by the mainstream media, and they'll say, yeah, but it's all about solar panels and the green agenda. But at least we forget that the green agenda really started with this very famous lady called Greta Thunberg, who was from Sweden. And she ran around the world going, how dare you? You stole my future. I mean, it's okay to have children mining lithium in Africa, but, her future mustn't be compromised. And what we do know is that Sweden has recently abandoned the green agenda and gone all in on nuclear again. So it seems that the birth child that gave us Greta has reversed their mistake and aborted Greta. But unfortunately, in South Africa, we still seem to have this hang up. Why would you say that is?
I worry when people attach corruption to a specific technology or to a specific group of people. Corruption comes in all directions. The private sector corrupts the government sector. Without the private sector, government would not be corrupt. So to say that when we build nuclear plants or even coal plants, then there would be corruption, as opposed to having renewables because the private sector is not corrupt. But those renewables are being delivered to us in such a corrupt way because we are hearing these stories of going green. And it's even said that we have outsourced our thinking and or the scientific knowledge and fact to people who have never seen how a power plant work, like the people you mentioned, and because now we have to save the future, and saving the future does not mean kill the current generation, because that's basically what this green agenda means. It means protect the next 2 generations by killing the current one. And so therefore, corruption is not attached to a specific technology. And if we need to address corruption, let's address corruption. But we cannot not implement other energy technologies on the basis that we think corruption will take priority, which is basically not true. And because that simply means we must sit in the dark. I always say to people who stay in Cape Town and oppose nuclear, I say to them, let's remove Gubek nuclear power plant and let's see what happens to you. And those who oppose coal power plants because they want to go green, municipality and Eskom must go switch off their companies, even banks. They must switch off their coal electricity in banks and in University of Cape Town, in everywhere. Let them go green or let them go off the grid. They need to set an example that going off the grid works.
Now, if I was an ANC strategist, this is exactly what I would do. Exactly what I would do. Oh, Cape Town, you want green energy?
Well, then let's switch off our nuclear power plant. Simple.
Very good. I fully accept that. That'll be great. Byron, when we meet the ANC again, in the back room, like we always do, somehow, this is what we're going to propose for the next election campaign. Vote for us. We switch off Kubek and coal plants to the Western Cape.
And
Hey,
to
Uncle
the banks,
Gwidi.
because we have banks, CEOs, some CEOs advocating for these green energy technologies. And they even do studies to say, this is the only solution. And okay, it's fine. Let's go to your bank and let's switch off our coal plant or our coal electricity, go off the grid, set an example. Let's see how it's going to work out for you. Then we will join later on.
Uncle Gwidi, take note. Take note. All of the banks that want to push this stuff, they all want their ESG scores. Turn off their electricity. They must have their solar panels, right?
Yes.
This is a great idea. I support this entirely.
Me too. 100%. 100%. Princess, thank you. You sort of answered all the questions I've had. I actually love this conversation, especially in terms of it's almost the green energy agenda is almost like child sacrifice. We think, back in 3,000 years ago in Africa and South America and in Asia and wherever, there was like child sacrifice to make the gods happy, right? You sacrifice your enemies, you sacrifice human beings to make the gods happy for a brighter future. That's exactly the same paradigm today, except we are using economic means and energy poverty to achieve this faith in the future. And so it's a very sort of eye-opening example that you use, and I really want to thank you for that.
And here's another one, just before you go.
Oh, sure.
Here's another one. All these solar panels, okay, probably majority of them, and wind turbines, they come from China. Do you know that?
Yeah, we do, yeah.
And
We
they
actually
are
did a video on this.
And they are manufactured using what? Coal and nuclear. Because you cannot manufacture solar panels and wind turbines using solar panels and wind turbines. So does that mean China must never go green? Because they need to manufacture these components that make us go green.
Well, it's funny you say that because, China is the world's largest polluter in terms of the anti-green agenda. And nobody seems to have a thing to say about them, probably because they'll nuke them into, oblivion. But the Chinese don't really sit around the whole Davos table going, yeah, solar panels. I think they tried it like once and a city went offline and they said never again. They're like, that doesn't work for us. Then they fired up all their coal power stations and said, we'll buy all your coal, please, for cheap. And everybody was like, that sounds like a good deal. But interestingly enough, Ramon, now that you mentioned that about child sacrifice, it is just the new age version of sun worship, sun and wind worship. Many years ago, we used to worship Ra, the sun god. Now we just worship the
So,
solar panel. Hey, and you know, Ramon, I know this to be true because when you first get your solar panels on your house, every morning you go out there and you have a look at those solar panels and you sip your cup of coffee and you're like, look at that. Solar on my house. It's true, isn't it?
It is true. In my defense, though, if there was residential nuclear units available, I'll be the first one in line. And unfortunately, there isn't, so
Yeah,
I had to
absolutely.
get solar panels. So, yeah, what can I say?
what can you say?
Indeed.
So another thing is maybe I'd like us to talk about is the green taxonomy. You know, that document that gives us directions to say the banks can finance or we can finance certain projects, especially if they fall under green
Oh,
financing.
yeah. So this is, they give you favorable loans and all that stuff if you
Yes,
fall
we
within
do have.
the accredited. Yeah.
Yes, we have a green taxonomy in South Africa, and it does not have nuclear and coal, which is the most worrying thing. You do know that last year, I think it was not even last year, it was just after COP27 in Egypt in Glasgow, when Europe Parliament voted for nuclear and gas to be part of the green taxonomy, meaning they can be financed now. But then why other countries such as South Africa are not following that?
Well, we've made the argument that unfortunately South Africa appears to be the testing ground for all failed ideologies. So we also noticed that around the world that there were various forms of, should we say, educational policies that most of the West has abandoned, but South Africa still uses. It's like every single failed ideology used elsewhere, we seem to keep whilst they ditch them. And what
Even
this would
their
appear
terms,
to be.
even their terminologies, just energy transition, that's a foreign concept. Minister Mantashe is correct. They sold this concept to us and we are proudly running with it. And after selling it to us, they went and requested the IPCC to use their fossil fuels until at least 2030 or 2035. At the same time, they gave South Africa money, 8.5 billion US dollars, to stop using coal.
Which I think Minister Mantashe did actually do the sums as to what would we be gaining in terms of financing for that agenda versus what do we lose from coal. And what he showed is that the amount of money they were offering doesn't actually even match what we spend currently on coal. So it wouldn't even get us to where we need to go. It's not the same amount of money. It's a bit like saying, I tell you what, I'll give you 10 Rand to not spend 100. It's like, how about you give me 1,000 Rand and I won't spend 100?
Then you
So I
won't
think
spend your.
yeah, then I think Minister Mantashe did it before, and he was like, the sums don't add up. But unfortunately, whilst the sums might not add up, the agenda does. And as we all know, these days the agenda matters far more than the finances.
So
You,
giving
you
crumbs
spoke
from the
about
cookie instead of the
Sweden.
actual cookie itself.
You spoke
It's
of
actually,
Sweden earlier on. And I don't know if you know that Sweden has actually abandoned this going green thing, this renewables only strategy. They are now considering adding more nuclear power plants, and they already have
That's
nuclear
right.
power plants. So it means that they are finally realizing that the foreign concept of just energy transition is not going to work. And the people, you know, the country that sold this to us is Germany, who has spent over 2 decades investing in renewables, their energy window project. And what they did not tell us is that they were backing it up with Russian gas and fossil fuels.
exactly.
As soon as they did not have access to that Russian gas, they came running to South Africa to get our coal. And they went running to Mozambique to get their gas.
Yeah, Germany
Absolutely.
spent $500 billion on renewable energy, close to $600 billion. And this is dollars, not rands, dollars. And I think the electricity price increase to like 10 times.
It went astronomically high.
And then as soon as there's a glitch in the system, i.e. the Russia-Ukraine situation, it failed completely.
They
So
were
$600
exposed.
billion down the drain, and now they're using our coal that should be going to Eskom to power Germany. It's treason. It really is treason.
We actually have enough coal. We can give German and still use our coal. But now,
Okay.
what I'm against is giving German coal and not using our coal for ourselves. That's the
Correct.
most absurd thing I've ever seen. To say somebody else must use your coal, but not you.
Yeah. Now, Princess, you and I and Byron are on exactly the same path with this, exactly the same
And I
thoughts.
do believe that the coal suppliers, they should actually prioritize Eskom. Eskom should be getting at least a 20% off when buying coal from suppliers, because it's our coal. That coal, it doesn't even belong to them. They only have a license to mine. It's our coal.
So I've actually spoken to someone who owns a coal mine and who operates coal mines in South Africa. He wants nothing more to supply Eskom, but the fundamental problem is getting the coal to Eskom. The train lines don't work anymore, so it's almost it's not impossible, but it's much more difficult.
Far more difficult.
BE comes into it, and then there's all sorts of other issues.
Remember
it's much easier to go to Richards Bay and export it. It's much easier to do
remember
that.
the issue is that to get to the power station is a single lane road. And so
And
obviously
they cut the conveyor belt, our government.
That's correct. And because we're on a single lane road, you can only have one truck behind each other. You can't have them like multiple trucks. So that gets, they're saying that in some areas there's up to 7 to 10 kilometers of tailback of trucks.
Yeah.
And those trucks just sit there. And then unfortunately, when they sit there, they're also prone to hijacking. So as a result, they struggle to get drivers that actually want to drive the route because it's a high risk theft area. So as a result, as Ramon says, they find it safer and more economic for them just to drive it quickly to Richards Bay Harbour, export it to Chinese. So that in itself is like self sabotage. The state sabotaging itself.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, but that's the unfortunately that's also an element in South Africa. But Princess, thank you for your time. I think we can all agree, Byron, Princess, and Ramon, we can all agree the government of South Africa needs to grow some testicular fortitude. It needs to do what's in the best interest of South Africa in terms of reducing energy poverty and increasing energy capacity so that South Africans can have jobs and thrive and not use, wood to power, to cook food, because we in 2023, people should, improve. And at the end of the day, it's a question really of political will, and tell the foreign fund NGOs to futzek. Simple as that.
I wonder how you're going to tell them, because we can blame them all we want, but they are finding loopholes in our policies and constitution, and they are utilizing that.
We should just go the same way as Zimbabwe and just ban them.
We just need South Africans to rally behind our policies or our energy policies, because especially what Minister Mantashe is saying, let's go for energy mix. This green agenda is not for us. We didn't even pollute this world. We are not responsible for polluting this world, and we are not going to be the ones responsible for reducing carbon emissions. I mean, if South Africa were to build even 20 more power stations, we would still be polluting less than what Germany is polluting.
Yeah, I think, but that's a point I've also heard Minister Montage say, which is, how about give us a chance, let us become a world #1 polluter, we'll create our economy to rival the US, and when we're the world's #1 polluter, then you come to us and you tell us to fix it, and we'll be like, oh yeah, sorry, yeah, we'll fix it, but don't punish us before we did the crime, because that's not really fair. I have to agree with him on that.
Excellent. We're all in agreement. Princess, if our viewers wish to find you, where can they follow you?
I am on TikTok at Prince Mthombeni. Yes. I'm also on Instagram. I'm on Twitter. And then on LinkedIn, I'm Princess Mthombeni.
Perfect. We'll link all of those down below in the description. Princess, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. It was very valuable, and I hope it is very valuable to our audience as well. Thank you, everyone.
Absolutely.
We will see you
Thank
all
you.
very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Thank you for
much.
joining us. Thanks.